Hi Lovebugs, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about Reckless by Lauren Roberts, and it is the second book in the Powerless trilogy. You guys really liked my first Powerless video, so I figure I have a few weeks before class starts, so let's give the people what they want, All of my new followers, hi, and thank you for being here. And to all of my old followers, I love you guys. Thank you. That's for you. And if you're not subscribed, hey, just to set the tone of the video, if you didn't watch my first video, we're going to try to balance between having a fun time and having genuine criticism. I'm aware that I'm probably not really the target audience for this book. It's just not really my vibe, and I recognize that, but it is still I think that it's fun to have literary criticism, so I'm going to try to have genuine discussion and genuine things that I want to talk about, while also, having a fun time. Making a little bit of fun, if you will. Some necessary backgrounding is that Powerless was originally self-published in, I think, 2018, but that might be wrong. And then it was republished through Simon & Schuster in 2023. And this book, Reckless, the sequel, is, to my knowledge, fully new, has not been originally self-published, and is just straight traditional publishing through Simon & Schuster again. Yeah, so that's where we are. This book is entirely new, is what I'm trying to say. And I think that's necessary context to have for the first thing that I want to say about this book, which is that I think the writing is better. I think that the writing style, just in terms of the sentence structure and the composition, I think is better. I think that it flows a lot easier. The sentences are better constructed. The grammar is better. I think that it works better in this book than it did in Powerless. And I don't give an ounce of credit for that to Simon & Schuster. I don't think they deserve any amount of credit for that, because the amount of typos they let get through is frankly shows me that they did a very lazy job of publishing that. I don't think that they spent more than $20 and half an hour editing this book. I do, however, think that this book has a little bit less substance than Powerless somehow. I was trying to think of, in my last video, I had a couple of topics that I wanted to hit on while I was talking about Powerless in terms of world building and story construction and thematic development, the commentary being developed. But this book, I feel really didn't have that much structure, or that much substance, which is crazy because Powerless also didn't have that much substance, and I don't want to be mean, but there was just a little bit less for me to grasp at in order to come up with topics to talk about. So just aware of that going into the video. I do have a couple things that I want to talk about, but it was a little bit more difficult to come up with. Okay, yeah, so with that preface out of the way, I didn't have extremely high expectations for this book because I kept seeing bad reviews of it. Even people who said they really loved the first book were saying that they didn't like the second book at all and that it was boring and nothing happened. So just put a pin in that, and as the video goes on, we can come back to that claim and see if we agree. So just to give a little bit of a recap of the ending of the previous book so we know where we are, you can skip this part if you already know. Our main characters are Peyton, Kai, and Kit, and they're living in this post-plague society where the effects of the plague have given some of the populations magic powers, and these are called the elites, but some of them did not get magic powers, and these are called ordinaries. And many years ago, the king of this land, Ilya, is the name of the land, not the king, sorry, that was confusing. The king of the land decided to commit a purging, is what they call it, of all the ordinaries, which essentially just commit genocide against the ordinaries. But our main character, Peyton, is secretly an ordinary. Kai and Kit are siblings. Kit is the heir to the throne, and Kai is heir to this position called the Enforcer, which is basically just a torturer, murderer, assassin. And murderer, assassin might sound redundant, but I think that the scale that he's operating at, I think it very much warrants being said twice. And at the very end of the book, the resistance fails to it's a very vague plan, but it doesn't work. They fail, and Peyton is confronted by the king. He tells her that the person who killed her dad several years ago was actually Kai, and Peyton is so upset. She kills the king, she runs away, and Kai catches her, but he can't bring himself to kill her, and so he lets her go, but he swears to come after her later once he's gathered his strength, you know? So that's where we are. That's where we leave off with the first book, and we're gonna kick off with the second book. So, okay. So we start with a prologue from Kai's perspective, and he is getting some sticky buns from the bakery, and the palace baker is like very maternal towards him. It's a very interesting relationship, in the fact that I think it's a little bit strange. But he gets a sticky bun from her, and the vibe is kind of that he's commemorating someone who has passed, and we don't know who it is just yet. But I really only bring this up because I want to talk about the sticky bun situation, because I think that sticky buns get mentioned probably like 10 times between both books, which isn't that many, but it is an absurd amount. Like, when you're actually reading it, like, it is mentioned an absurd amount of times. Anytime they eat anything, basically, they're eating a sticky bun. And that led me to a theory that, and this is not a serious thing, like, this is not serious literary criticism right now, but I do have to get it out there because I believe it with my entire soul. It led me to a theory that the author is from the Midwest. And as soon as I decided that she was from the Midwest, just like, I haven't verified this. I have no idea where she's from, truly. But I know in my heart of hearts that she's from the Midwest. Because as soon as I came up with this theory, I saw the Midwest everywhere in this series. It just had such a Midwestern vibe to it. It's kind of like whenever you find out that Stephenie Meyer is Mormon, and then you look at Twilight and you're like, oh my god, this book is so Mormon. It's exactly like that. And what do I base this off of? Basically nothing. I don't think that sticky buns are indigenous to the Midwestern region. I don't think that sticky buns originated there or anything. But I was recently in Utah, which is not the Midwest, but is as close to the Midwest as I've ever gotten, and my friend had a sticky bun there. But also, to corroborate this theory, I think that a lot of the typos that get through might be a result of typing out what you hear in a localized regional dialect or regional accent. So like, for example, in the first book, there are multiple occasions, actually every time this word is mentioned, it's misspelled. And it's the word scalding for something that's hot. She'll say that something is scalding hot, but instead of scalding, she says it's scolding. It's scolding hot. This metal is scolding, which is a completely different word. But I think it could be explained by just hearing people say the word in an accent and then typing it out, thinking that that's how the word is spelled, because that's how it's said, like in a Midwestern accent. Is that how the word scalding is pronounced in a Midwestern accent? I don't even know. Truly, like, might not be. Anyway, the book really starts off in chapter 1, and we're in Peyton's perspective, and she has made it back to her dad's old house, where she's been for the last 3 days. And I think it's not a great idea to go to this house, because presumably the king has record of all the places that the resistance is known, like, known resistance supporters have been, like, resistance strongholds, resistance houses. So this house would be on the list of places they would check for her. But it doesn't matter because she's been there for 3 days and she's good. She has enough time to gather up some supplies to heal her wounds a little bit, or like patch up her wounds a little bit. And she hears people trying to break through the door, and she's able to hide up the chimney. She like clings and hides up the chimney. Which is great, you know, good for her. Very Inej. Here are a couple of quotes that I wanted to talk about. Searing pain shoots down my raised arm when the brand above my heart pulls taut with movement. That's not how you spell taut. I don't want to harp on the grammar too much, but again, like, this is a big five publisher, this is $1 billion corporation, and it really feels like they didn't have anybody editing that. Like, it feels like they just saw the raw rough draft and were like, okay, good. It's Here's the thing, is that whenever people talk about like the TikTok effect, like how TikTok is affecting publishing, the way that TikTok is making publishers like fast fashion, this is the book they're talking about. Like, this, if I had to choose like a poster child for that line of thinking, this would be it, because the editing is poor and it's a very well established, very reputable publishing house, so it doesn't make any sense that they would do this unless they're just trying to push out the product as fast as possible in order to make sales because they know it'll do well on TikTok. Like, that really is the vibe that it gets, and it's really disheartening, and it makes me view Simon & Schuster worse, because it's like, wow, they can't even be bothered to have one person go through this book before they send it to the press. Kai doesn't find her because she's hidden in the chimney, but she hears what she says to his troops. He like leads this group of troops, and she realizes that he's been torturing the like members of the resistance that he captured after their failed attempts to do something. And babe, girl to girl, you can't still have a crush on this guy. Like, we have to have some self-respect. We have to do better. Somebody brought this up in my comments on my last video, and I think that it was a really good point, is that like, we don't need more romanticized violent men. You know, it's not something that we need as a society, to hail this like very violent and like fantasy racist person as like this desirable love interest. Like, we don't need to do that. And I definitely understand the like the bad boy of it all, the tortured soul, the I can fix him of it. But I feel like there is a limit, you know? There is a limit to how bad the boy can be before he's just a bad man, you know? And that, I think that we crossed that line many tortures ago. As Kai is talking to his soldiers, his tone is described as bored. He has a bored tone. And this is just gonna set off something that I'm gonna talk about later in the video. It's gonna be our first little foreshadowing of something, which is that I don't think the way that Kai is described in the role of enforcer, because now with the King's Stud, he has like taken on the role of enforcer, which is really a promotion in name only. He was doing all the torturing and murdering well before he got this promotion. But now that he's in this role, he's also in command of troops. And I don't think the way that it's described makes like really a whole lot of sense. I don't think it's very compelling. For him to be described as bored while he's giving orders and stuff just doesn't really make sense to me in this context. I understand the vibe that she's going for. I understand it like maybe apathetic or pragmatic, calm, something like that. But bored is weird, and it's the way that his relationship to his work is described is like, if that makes sense, like, is kind of weird throughout the book. It kind of feels like the author wanted him to be this lone wolf, bad boy, winter soldier, like silent assassin kind of thing. But then why also make him a commander? Why also put him in charge of a group of underlings? Why not just let him go out and do this by himself? Because that really feels like what we want from Kai, is for him to be this like solo act. But as soon as he starts to be around other people, it really I don't think it works quite so well. I think that the book would work better if he was just by himself. Which I think that does make sense, given that he has this like solo role. He is the enforcer. Like, that to me sounds like a role that you do alone. Or that he has his own band of soldiers that like he has personally selected and that he has vetted and that he's worked with for years. Like, those are kind of the two things that I would expect from somebody in this role. But for him to just have like random guards with him and be commanding them, it's like, what's the difference between him and any other military captain? And yeah, anyway, we're gonna move on from that because he sets the house on fire as he's leaving, and she has to escape, obviously, because she's in the chimney where smoke goes. And so she's running away, and they're chasing her. She's running across the rooftops, and he needs to get her on the ground, but he can't because he doesn't have an ability that will let him do that. Which is convenient. If you don't remember, Kai's power is to take on the powers of the people around him. So he's like, oh man, I wish I had a telepath. No, wait, that's the wrong word. I wish I had a telekinesis person with me so that I could just put her on the ground instead of on the roof. And it's like, yeah, maybe you should have picked your soldiers with a little bit more intention, Maybe pick somebody from every most important power and then you'd be good. But anyway, she's escaping. She has to kill one of the soldiers who's following her with she throws a knife at his chest and he dies. And this is important because Peyton really hates to kill people, which is a great trait to have as a person. And actually, I don't say that sarcastically. I really do like that Peyton doesn't like to kill people. It sets up a contrast that isn't ever really capitalized on between her and Kai, where she really doesn't like to kill people and Kai kills people for a living. So Kai comes across the dead body and he stops chasing her and he says to the dead body, let me look, he says, she would have buried you if she weren't so busy running from me. She shouldn't do that. The way that this chapter is written, the way that the scene is written, very much seems like Peyton would have just dropped everything and buried this man on the side of the road as if he's the family dog, got hit by a car, as if he's a raccoon they found on the side of the road. She should not do that. That's not what you do when people die. You don't just bury them in an unmarked grave in the middle of the street. And also the way that Kai goes about this, he's like, okay, I guess I'll have to bury you for her. Babe, don't do that. That's not normal. And I have to assume that he takes the body back to the castle and he informs the family and probably has to compensate the family in some way because he died in the line of duty. They have a funeral. They have a marked grave with a headstone. I have to assume that's what happened, but the way that it's written really just seems like Kai starts digging, which is crazy, which is absolutely wild. I think that's really funny though. I wouldn't change a thing. Peyton decides that she's going to escape through the Scorches, and okay, so I'll put up a picture of the map of this universe. The beginning of the book gives us a map of the world and a family tree, which I found honestly very difficult to read. The family tree, I think that it just had too many leaves or something. It was too ornate. I have no idea what you're trying to tell me. On one side of Ilya, there is this big ocean, and on the other side, there is this big desert. And so Peyton decides that she's going to cross the Scorches to the city of Dor, and yeah, that's that. And if we remember from the previous book, whenever people are caught harboring ordinaries, they get exiled into the Scorches. And Kai does this with a family and their little girl who is an ordinary. And he sends them out into the Scorches rather than killing the kid. And the way that he describes it is very much 100% they're going to die. There's no way they're going to make it. Absolutely not. They're going to have a slow, painful death across this enormous desert. So let me read you a quote from this book. This is from Pei's perspective. I'll make it to Dor in roughly 5 days. That is, if I can manage to walk for nearly the entire time. 5 days in the desert is a lot, don't get me wrong, but the way that it was described, I thought it would be weeks of travel. I was picturing the Red Sea from Game of Thrones. I was picturing the Sahara. I was picturing this enormous, incrossable desert that they just had no chance at. And yeah, crossing this enormous desert with no provisions, with no food, no water, Yeah, you probably aren't gonna make it. Like, that's pretty rough. But the way that it's described, like, I was picturing a much bigger desert. I mean, 5 days is not even enough time to resort to cannibalism. I guess this is maybe the first, like, little bit of world building that we can talk about, which is just that Ilya is described many, many times as being extremely isolated from the rest of the world. It has this big ocean on one side, it has a desert on one side, so there are these geographic boundaries that keep Ilya separate from the rest of the world. And it seems very much like through the way that they talk about it, and I actually am going to touch on this later again, it seems like they have very limited communication with the rest of the world. A quote from chapter 20, which we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but here's a quote. Ilya has remained isolated ever since, in order to ensure that we are the only kingdom with elites. So there are many quotes like that, but that was just one of them. I don't think that I wrote down any more. There are many quotes like that that really imply that Ilya is just very separatist. They don't interact with the rest of the outside world. They have very limited communication. So a couple of things. 5 days is not really enough time to give you a suitable boundary. Like, 5 days is enough time for an invading army to prepare for. They can still come in. And I know that the idea is that, like, the threat of these people being elites is what keeps the invading armies out. But I just don't really buy that, because you could just, and this is gonna sound crazy, you could just develop your military technology and, like, you'd probably be able to beat these people. So something that I talked about in my last video is just that the time period was a little bit difficult for me to understand, because the way that they talk and the way that they dress feels extremely modern, especially the way they talk. But there is no technology to speak of, and what I mean by that is, like, communication. There don't seem to be telephones, there don't seem to be, like, even telegraphs. There's no form of transportation, there's not a train, there's not a bus, there's not anything like that. And a 5 day walk in the desert is like a couple hours on a pretty slow train. So they could very easily put a train across this thing. And I think you could make the argument that Ilya doesn't have technology because they have abilities, because they have powers. And I think that does make a little bit of sense, but not a ton of sense, because not everybody has the same set of powers. So people would need technology for other things. So, like, a person who can teleport might not take the city bus, but a person who can mind read should take the bus, because how else are they going to get places, you know? Also, just, like, Ilya is very impoverished, and that might be a reason for their lack of technology. But the fact of the matter is, Ilya does not have technology. I will accept the argument that they don't have technology because they are elite. But if we accept that argument, then I think we should also consider the possibility that the cities outside of Ilya do have technology because they don't have abilities. Because, like, if there is this society of people with magic powers that you don't understand, you're probably going to pour in a lot of resources to military technology and to just technology in general in order to potentially fend off from an invasion from them, or just to kind of match up with them. So I think that it is very possible. What I'm trying to round back to is that I do still think it's possible that this 5 day desert does very little to prevent an incoming army from coming across, and they would just have better technology. As soon as guns get invented in this universe, having your ability is not gonna help you. So if I can be potentially revisionist and offer a fix for this, I think that it would be stronger if, instead of just the physical geographic barrier between other countries, if Ilya had some kind of a wall around it, at least on the desert side. That would really reinforce the, like, elitism and the xenophobia, honestly. I think that, like, having it being a man-made barrier between them and everybody else just reads a lot stronger than it just coincidentally being a natural barrier. Because it shows intention, right? It shows that there was time and effort and labor dedicated to making sure that Ilya is completely separate from the rest of the world, because they believe themselves to be better than the rest of the world, because they don't want to interact with, like, the people who are lesser than them. I think that that reads a lot stronger. And maybe you're thinking, hey, that kind of sounds a little similar to some real life politics And maybe we don't want to make that political commentary here. Hey, I thought that was what the book was about. Like, I thought. What's crazy about this series is that anytime I want to start to talk about the politics of it, I feel like, oh, maybe that's kind of out of place in this book because it's, not that serious. But why'd you bring it up? Like, the book is essentially about ethnic cleansing. Like, that is what's happening with the elites. But somehow every time, like, I want to talk about politics, I have this feeling in the back of my head that, like, oh, this book isn't that deep. Like, you're reading too much into it. Why'd you bring it up then? So Kit sends Kai to go find Peyton, and he says to bring her back alive. And, okay, but also, when Kai does set out, he has his, like, gaggle of random soldiers with him. So it's, again, it feels like something that Kit should be like, you go do this on your own because, like, you're the one who brought this girl into our house, basically, and, like, who had a relationship with her, and I'm mad at you, blah, blah, blah. Like, you go do this by yourself because you're in a singular role. But no, he goes with, like, a group of X amount of other people who never get names and who are so irrelevant to the story that honestly it would be more economical to just write them out. But I'm gonna get to that. So we go back to Peyton. She's been in the desert for 3 days, which really reinforces my point that it's not that long of a trip because we hard cut to 3 days into the desert and, like, apparently nothing of note has happened in the first 3 days. So this is in chapter 5. We're moving a little bit slow right now, but we're going to pick up the pace once we get to the middle. My water supply is running dangerously low, and simply knowing that fact makes my throat even drier. The canteens clinging in my pack will be empty in no more than 2 days. So 3 + 2 is 5, so we're good. So we're fine. So I'm not really feeling a whole lot of tension here because we're fine. We get to Door, and she has to be helped the, like, last stretch by this soldier who helps her across, and then immediately recognizes her as the girl who killed the king. He says, "You wouldn't happen to be the girl who killed the king?" And that's almost a direct quote. She says, and then they, like, fight, and she has to kill him too, which she's sad about. So what we learn is that Ilya has put a bounty on her, and something that we get repeated very many times is that the bounty says dead or alive. But we just said that Kit wanted her alive, so I guess he changed his mind, but anyway. But also this is another issue with the whole Ilya being so isolated. Like, we're really reinforcing this point of Ilya being so isolated, but they have pretty immediate communication with the outside world. And it's also not clear how that communication happens because we don't know about the technology. I guess they just send, like, a man across the desert with a bunch of posters to be like, hey, put these up. We'll give you X amount of money if you send our girl back. And then also we find out that the posters have also made it across the ocean, which nobody has been able to cross in very many years, to the, like, island society. So how are we sending those posters? Because if we're using, like, a carrier pigeon, like a bird of some kind, those work using migration habits. So the birds have, like, 2 established points that they travel between, and they can just bring messages, which implies that there is established communication between these 2 countries, which really undermines the idea that Ilya is so isolated. But who cares? Maybe Kit sends an email, because I have no idea what year it is, so maybe he just emails them a PDF of this wanted poster, and they print it out on their Canon printer. And then Kai arrives in Door, and yeah, he says to us in chapter 8, I don't have any page numbers, don't ask me why. My appearance is well known throughout the neighboring cities, seeing that they view Ilya and its royalty like a bedtime fairy tale. We are idolized in the way that mutual dislike brings people together, providing petty gossip when there's a lull in conversation. That second sentence was a little bit clunky, but no matter. That doesn't make any sense. Like, just within that paragraph, that doesn't make sense. Because how do they know? How is your appearance so well known, but your fairy tale, a bedtime fairy tale, idolized, and they only know you through gossip. Like, everything that you've described is secondhand. This fairy tale, idolization, gossip, those are not primary sources. That is not how you know how people look like. That all implies that they have a vague general idea of who you are, and that they're probably pretty off base. I could sit here and I could describe somebody's face shape and jawline and their eyebrows and how wide their nose is and how big their lips are, and I could tell you the exact like shape of their eyes and the Pantone code for their hair color and their eye color and their lip color, skin color, and you still wouldn't be able to pick them up out of a police lineup, because that's not how it works. Like, you can't just describe somebody enough that it makes a really clear image in your head. I guess maybe if you're like a police sketch artist you can do that, but I'm assuming that most people in the audience are not. Like, you can describe somebody in immense detail and still have no idea what they look like. But somehow everybody recognizes him on sight, even though Ilya is so secluded. Also, how do they even have gossip of Ilya? I buy the fairy tale thing. I definitely buy, like, them having this fairy tale idea of what the enforcer is, and him being this, like, big bad, kind of like the Krampus. So, but because they're being recognized on sight, they have to disguise themselves. Pei, like, has a scarf around her hair to hide that, which is also, like, she says, like, is kind of the fashion indoor, because it is this like desert community, and people do that to keep the sand off. Kai like hides his face with a bandana of all things, and yeah, so they're good. Pei needs money is the issue that we're running into. Pei needs money, and so she joins this illegal underground cage fighting ring. She tells like the guy at the cash register, it's not a real cash register, it's just to give you an image of it. Obviously I don't know if cash registers exist in this universe or not, but she tells the guy, Raphael, who runs the fight ring, she says, "Can I fight?" And he says, "No." And she says, "It would be a shame if the city guards found out about your fight club." Girl, don't do that. You are so lucky that guns don't exist in this universe, because what makes you think that you can threaten the guy who runs the cage fighting ring? But he thinks it's cute. He thinks it's quirky. He's like, "Oh, okay. You got me there. You can fight." And so she does. And her fighter name is Shadow. I feel like we could do better with her fighter name. I don't have any suggestions for fighter names, but if anybody does, I would love to hear about them in the comments. Kai is walking through the city of Dor and immediately gets mugged, which I love about him, because he also gets jumped twice whenever he's in Ilya in the previous book. So it's something that I really love about Kai, is that even though he's this big baddie, he can't go anywhere without somebody trying to rob him. I think that's great. I think that's really funny. And he turns around and he grabs the thief. And you'll never guess who it is, but the little girl that he sent into the desert last book. I accidentally predicted this in my last video. It really wasn't intended to be a prediction, but because I really didn't think that it was gonna happen, but it did. And maybe in the sequel we like meet up with this family again, and they've somehow miraculously made it across the scorches so that we can absolve him of all his war crimes. I don't think it's great. I think it kind of weakens some of the commentary here, because it does, in a way, kind of absolve Kai of some of the blame and the guilt of his actions. Like, because we know that he has routinely been disobeying his dad by sending the kids into the desert instead of killing them. If this one kid made it, how many more did? And maybe that means that Kai has actually been saving these kids. Maybe he's actually doing a good thing. And I think that that kind of weakens the stance. The darker and edgier way to do this, I think, would be similar to something that happens in Game of Thrones. This is like very minor spoilers. It's not really like a plot point that's important. There is this point in Game of Thrones where the Hound, one of the characters, is getting like refuge in this house with this dad and his daughter. He ends up stealing all their resources for the like coming winter, and leaving them basically to die. And then later in the series, a couple episodes later, or a season later, he finds his way back to the house and he finds that they have passed away as a result of this. And I think that, like, if we did something like that in the desert, where Kai is walking through the desert and he stumbles across like the caravan of this family that has starved to death. Well, they don't have enough time to starve to death. It's only 5 days. Where they have died of dehydration, and he sees their like dried out skeletal remains, and he's forced to come to recognize the fact that like he did this. He's responsible for this. And how many other kids is he responsible for? How many other families is he responsible for? Something to really make him reckon with his actions and with his own morality and, you know, what he's willing to do. I think that that is something that's kind of missing throughout the series, is just like the characters being forced to think about what they're doing, to think about the because the thing is that like we are kind of doing this Hunger Games-esque thing where there is the oppressive tyrannical government and there is the group of the resistance, but there isn't really any conversation about which side is right or about the morality of either side, about the ethics of either side. And so if we had more points throughout the book, throughout the series, where the characters have to actually think about it, where they have to challenge their beliefs, or they have to challenge themselves to think about these things, I think it would make the book like that much stronger. And it doesn't have to be that dark. Like, I recognize that would be a very dark and maybe not fit the tone of the book. But again, listen to me saying that it doesn't fit the tone of the book that is about genocide. Like, you wanted to write a book that's about genocide, you kind of have to deal with the realities of it. Here's what it is, I think, I just thought of this, is that we hear about the genocide on this very large scale. We hear about, they killed, like, so many people, there are no ordinaries left, it's so brutal, but we don't really see it on a smaller level, on a person by person basis, on a small scale. We don't see the details of it. And whenever you're dealing with an injustice that is this large, with a violence that is this large, the way to make it more clear to the audience, the way to really communicate it and emphasize how bad it is to go smaller. So it's kind of like we need to see very specific things in order to grasp the big picture, because the big picture is so large that it becomes abstract. It becomes difficult to grasp because we as people just aren't really equipped to understand like large sums. It's a scene in the movie Mulan where she and the like troop of soldiers that she's with are singing and they're having a good time and they're approaching this village, and when they get there it has been completely destroyed and everything is burned, and we see like the remains of the houses and just like the burnt wood and everything. And then within that, Mulan like kind of crouches down and she picks up a child's doll, and it's this like little dolly that has scorch marks on it. And that is such an important moment in this scene because it humanizes it. You know, we see this huge village and we can think, oh, that's terrible, like what a horrible thing that happened. But once you get to this smaller detail, that is what really evokes the emotion in it. That's what makes it feel more real once you get to those specifics, because it's just difficult to comprehend like large scale. But I think that that's something that the book could benefit from, and just that I think is necessary for books that deal with this kind of topic. But anyway, he finds the kid and she immediately takes him exactly to where Peyton is, so that was easy. At this point, I want to take a break to talk about the trials, because you'll notice that we haven't mentioned them since the last book, and that's because they don't matter. The trials are completely useless. There is no political motive to speak of, and we don't even get a political motive in the first book. There's no justification for really why the trials are happening. There's this idea that it is such an honor to be in the trials, that it's like a display of elite power, but that I don't totally buy that, because it's just why would you risk the lives of the prince? Because Jax and Kai both compete in the trials. They're both from the royal family. Most of the other elites that are competing are also from noble families. Why would you have them compete in a competition that could potentially kill them? if you're trying to talk about elite superiority, like if you're trying to emphasize how strong and great the elites are. Also, if you want those people to like continue to be elites, I assume that you would want like Blair and them to grow up and to have roles in society, to have kids who are also powerful. Like, why would you potentially end bloodlines? Why would you potentially end positions of power by putting the elite in like the hierarchical sense also into this competition? That doesn't make any sense. But also, there's just no reward for winning or really repercussion for losing. If you die, obviously that's a repercussion, but if you survive and you lose, it kind of seems like nothing happened. It kind of seems like you're fine. Like, okay, sorry, you get to go home. You have to go to work tomorrow, you know? Like, nothing happens. But also, if you win, you also don't get anything. It also just retroactively makes it difficult to care about the trials in the first book, because I know that it doesn't affect anything. Nothing changes due to the trials. The only thing that really matters from the trials is like when the resistance breaks in and tries to whatever they do. It's just, it makes this book feel very disconnected from the first book, because it's like the trials didn't even need to happen in order for this book to happen. So it just feels very, I don't know, it just feels like they're two separate stories. Yeah, anyway. Let's get back to the plot, because Kit has a chapter. Kit has a perspective in this book. He only gets like 5 or so, but this is going to be controversial because I know that people don't like Kit's chapters, but I actually do like Kit's chapters. And I think that is because, like, at the phase of my life right now that I'm in, I really like literary fiction, and that's kind of where these chapters lean, is that, like, it's just him being sad and grieving his dad and reflecting on his relationships and, you know, all of that good stuff. Anyway, here's a quote for you guys. Pore over every detail of our short shared experience. It's the wrong kind of pour. That's an error that I've never seen before. That I've seen a couple of, like, you know, you use the wrong form of their or your. Using the wrong form of pour, I have never seen. But anyway, Kit's just being sad and he's writing poetry, which is disgusting. I hate it when men do that. He says, this is chapter 12. I know we're still pretty early in the book, but I promise the pace is going to pick up once we get to the second half. And then she's spilling onto the page again, a variation of words I've strung together before, a ballad of betrayal, a sonnet of sorrow. I'm tired of writing from the villain's perspective. What do you mean? Hang on. I think that this is the last sentence of the chapter, and it feels like it's just kind of shoehorned in to, like, make it a little bit more edgy, because what do you mean Kit feels like he's writing from the villain's perspective? From his perspective, from where he's sitting, he's not the villain. Pei just killed his dad and betrayed him for the resistance that he still believes to be, like, genetically inferior. Like, in his perspective, I don't see how he sees himself as the villain. He would see himself as the wronged party. So I don't think that makes sense. And it feels like it just wanted to make him seem a little bit edgier, seem a little darker. But that just doesn't really compute for me, because I don't think that he would view himself that way. I think that it would be really strong if we saw Kit, like, absolutely firm in his perspective, like fully believing that he is right and Peyton has done him wrong and he is the one who is hurt here, and he is absolutely correct in what he's doing in sending Kai after her and everything, because I think that would just be more interesting. Cutting back to Kai and Pei, he sees her fighting in the cage fighting ring, and he recognizes her immediately. He recognizes her fighting style, and he decides that he's gonna fight her, and he tells Raphael, the guy at the cash register, can I fight her? And he says, whatever. And his fighter name is Flame, and I still feel like we can do better, but I have a quote for you. This girl is the very thing I can't seem to escape, can't seem to go anywhere without the remnants of her following. Wherever I am, she is. whether it's in the flesh or in the fragments of my mind. Where there is flame, there is always a shadow. She is my inevitable. And like, that's the kind of like pseudo-philosophical, pseudo-poetic shit that I would have ate up if it was on Wattpad in 2014. And I know that sounds mean, and I feel like this whole video has sounded more mean than I intend. I recognize that. I know that. I know that sounds mean, but I'm being so serious. Like, I would have eaten this up when I was a kid. And I mean that, like, also to say that I'm not in the target audience for this. If I had read this when I was in that phase of my life, I would have been all over it. And so, like, I totally understand and I get why people like this series, because I also would have liked this series if I read it in a different phase of my life. But unfortunately, I'm old and jaded now. If this was on Wattpad, this would have changed my life. I'm being so serious. This would have been insane to me. This would have I would have lost my mind. So I get it. Is what I'm trying to say. I get it. They're fighting and she tears off his bandana, and so everybody in the crowd immediately recognizes who he is, and he's like, "Are you really gonna kill me in front of all of these witnesses?" Oh, I forgot to say, she has a knife, because she always has a knife somewhere, so she's holding it on him. "Are you really gonna kill me in front of all these witnesses?" Babe, you're in an underground cage fighting ring. These witnesses specifically would love that shit. If somebody got stabbed to death in an illegal underground cage fighting ring, that's a good day. That's good for business. Also, you've just been revealed to be the guy that they all unanimously hate. They would be so excited if she killed you right now. So I don't think that's a great defense. So, Peyton's not that girl. She's not that kind of girl. She's not just gonna kill this guy. She should. But then, he kind of gets the upper hand in the fight, and he rips off her scarf, and so they all recognize her on sight immediately. And then they just go. Kai's like, "We're fucking leaving. Don't come at me." And then they leave. And it was at this point in the book that I was reminded that she's 17, which is disgusting to me. Actually really ruined the rest of the book for me. There's somewhere in the last book I read that Kai was 19, and so I guess I just overrode in my brain and assumed that Pei was also 19 and that they were the exact same age, but that's not true. Pei is 17, Kai is 19, which means that kid has to be at least 20 because, he's older than Kai. Kid needs to leave that little girl alone. And I'm not the kind of person who thinks that adults shouldn't read YA. I honestly don't care. I don't feel positively or negatively about adults reading YA because I don't think it's a positive or negative thing. I think that it's extremely neutral, and I don't care about that. But me personally, I don't like to read about characters who are 17. I don't want to read about kids who are 17. I don't want to do that. Because, I'm old as fuck now, and I don't want to read about these kids. Anytime they, get, flirty or they kiss, which they haven't done quite yet, but they will very often soon. Anytime they do that, it makes me feel like a jaded high school geometry teacher in, senior prom watching my students make out. Yeah, from Ushers playing in the background, and I'm drinking a Dixie cup full of high C fruit punch, and I'm thinking about how this is so nasty and I'm gonna have to see these kids on Monday. Pei tells Kit that he killed her dad, and he's like, "Oh fuck, I did do that, sorry." And here's a couple things. This is the first time that Kai has ever killed somebody, was when he killed Pei's dad. So I get that he has, I think it does make a lot of sense that he has such a clear memory of it and that he's able to recall it. But, hear me out, I think in terms of development, in terms of commentary, I think it might be stronger if he didn't remember. If she describes this to him in such detail, she tells him exactly how it happened and when it happened and where it happened and like all these things, and he just has no memory of it because it's happened so many times, because he's done this to so many people. And again, that would be another opportunity to force him to reconsider his own actions, to reconsider who he is and like his morality. If he has to think about like, how many fathers have I killed, how many kids have I made orphans, how many friends and lovers and family members have I taken from people, and really just go in depth into that. And Kai does, like, he is very sad about this and he is like sorry about it, but I just think it could be a little bit stronger. But anyway, they go to an inn, and guess how many beds there are? I guess that's another thing about this book, is that whenever people talk about tropification and like the TikTok effect, like books being written around tropes rather than tropes just like being an added bonus in books, this is what they're talking about, because this book at times really does read as if it just includes tropes in order to make one of those like Instagram post recommendations where it's just like the cover of the book and the arrows coming off of it that list out all the tropes that are inside the book. The effect of that is that it feels very contrived. Anytime one of these tropes comes across, it loses like the feeling of that trope, because it feels like it was just written to check a box, you know? It doesn't evoke the same emotions as actually reading that trope organically, because it just feels contrived. It feels artificial. It feels forced, and that makes it feel lifeless. And so like anytime these tropes happen, it's just like, oh damn, like I guess we're doing this. Another thing going on in this book is that Kai has no power for the majority of this book, because once they get to Dor and like he branches off from his men to go find Pei, he's no longer around other elites, so he can't take their powers. Like he can't take on their powers. So he has nothing. And I think that this would have been a really interesting opportunity to kind of examine Kai as a person when he is separate from his abilities. I was thinking of this scene in JJK, which is embarrassing, but I was thinking of this scene in JJK where one of the characters is essentially asked, like, do you define your power, or does your power define you? Are you defined by your power, or can you define yourself? And I think that would be a really interesting predicament for Kai to find himself in. Also because whenever he's not around other elites, this will first of all be the first time in his life that he is not around other elites. And so that new feeling, I think, should be explored a little bit. But then also, when he's not around other elites, who is he? When he's not around other elites, he is basically ordinary. He doesn't have any powers. He can't do anything. So maybe does that push him in his perspective of ordinaries? Does that make him think a little bit differently? Does that make him want to consider other perspectives? I think that could be interesting. And Kai takes her back to his men, and they're gonna set out back into the desert on the way back. And in circling back to his relationship with like positions of power, he says to one of the soldiers in chapter 19, I haven't even bothered to learn your name, soldier. That is how little I value your life. That doesn't make you sound badass. That makes you sound bad at your job. He and Pei are basically like play fighting and flirting, and it's like kind of under the guise of them being genuinely fighting, but the vibes are there. And Kai insists on sleeping with her, like literally, not like just sleeping, so that he can like keep watch of her, so he can like have his arm around her while she's sleeping. The secondhand embarrassment that I felt for these other soldiers that were with them is actually like incalculable. Like the way that I would quit on the spot. Why would they not just have one of the soldiers like stay up overnight to be like their night guard or like the night watch, so that they can keep an eye on her? Maybe like half of them sleep for half of the night and the other half sleep the rest of the night. Like it doesn't that make more sense than just trusting that in your sleep you're gonna be able to hold on to this girl so she can't escape? Like, anyway, I think that the I think that this scene specifically makes so much more sense if the other men aren't there, first of all, because then, like, he would have to justify it by, like, holding on to her. We wouldn't have the other men to kind of dilute that. Because, like, if they're alone and there's nobody to potentially be a night guard, then he has to hold on to her. And oh no, I guess we have to cuddle tonight. Like, I think that works better. But also the addition of all these other men is especially confusing because they all die in this chapter. All of them die in the night because they don't have a night guard. It's the resistance. And they don't kill Kai, naturally, because but yeah, it's the resistance. They come get Pei. They're like, hey, we're here to rescue you. They somehow found her in exactly the right place at the right time. Really interesting. And they tell Pei, they're like, hey, Pei, the resistance is done. Like, we got fucked in whatever we were doing. We didn't even get to do our big speech about how you shouldn't commit genocide. And it's like, I can't actually think of a worse plan than showing up to a group of the most powerful people in the country, holding a fucking knife on the king and being like, hey everybody, listen to me talk for however many minutes so I can convince you to completely change your values. Like, I don't think that was ever gonna work, so maybe we should have workshopped it before we did it. But yeah, they tell her, like, we're done. Yeah, no more resistance. We got our asses handed to us, and that's it. Sorry. Okay, kind of bleak. What we're introduced to the concept of mixes, which is not a word that I like, but it's a half ordinary, half elite person. So they're given a fraction of elite power. Kai is able to pick up on their power, and he says that it's a percentage, it's a fraction of the power that it was originally going to be. In a world building sense, I don't think this makes sense because there is just such a large array of what the powers are, and there's really nothing to dictate like how strong each of those powers are. There's no index, there's no catalog of what all the powers are. So if you meet someone who has like a weaker version of an existing power, you would probably just assume that they had a different power that happens to be weaker. So for example, because I have examples, Kit's power is called Dual. Dual is in 2 because it is water and fire. But there are other people in the society who only have water, which you could argue is a fraction of what Kit's power is. So, also, don't fucking tell me that Kai can sense a percentage of power within people when he couldn't sense shit from Pei, and he was fully convinced that she just had a really weak power, that she just had a really low-lying power that he couldn't sense because it was a mental ability. Don't fucking tell me now that he can calculate the percentage of what, like, that he can be like, oh shit, this person has 37.8% of this power. No, he can't, because he sensed nothing from Pei and he still thought she had an ability. That is ridiculous. So I think that I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense in the narrative, but we do learn that being elite is genetic. That's something that we kind of learn here, is that whether or not you have power is genetic, because it can be diluted with, by, I don't know, being a recessive gene. I don't know. But I kind of don't like that because I guess the justification for the genocide was that having ordinary people in our society is a threat to elite power. Then this kind of validates that. Like, this kind of this kind of says that that's true. And I don't think that we're in a position to, like, add any amount of validity to the genocide. Also, we must remember Pei's dad was an elite and she's ordinary. So let's put a pin in that and come back to it. They are with the resistance for a chapter, I think, like maybe like a chapter and a half. And then midway through a chapter, they wake up and they're in a jail cell with Raphael, and who is the guy who ran the cage fighting ring, and he has captured them soundlessly in the night and managed to bring them back to his underground jail where they are now. And so, what happened to the resistance, you ask? They're actually not mentioned again in the book, so maybe we'll come back to it in the third. And so again, the book very much is giving Wattpad, because the way that it plays out from like the middle, basically the whole middle, really plays out like a Wattpad fan fiction. And I do have an explanation for that. So what I mean is that it's written very episodically. Every chapter we have like a problem arises and it is solved, and maybe there's like a little bit of extra to keep us wanting to come back for the next chapter. But it's very much like we get little things happening, but the overall plot is not moving. So whenever people online were saying that this book was so boring, nothing happened, I think actually like a lot of little things happen. Things are always happening, but the overall plot is not moving. So like, what have we done? We were in the cage fighting ring. We went to the soldiers. We went to the resistance. We're with Raphael. We still haven't moved in the plot. Just like getting A to B, like Dora to Ilya, we're still in the same position. So generally the plot is not progressing, but there are little things happening. And it does very much read as if it's being written and released on a sporadic basis, like a Wattpad fanfiction would be, just like to appease, like giving like little breadcrumbs, little like episodic adventures for an audience that's going to come back every week or so, periodically. Ugh, I've been talking for so long. They escape through the sewer tunnel that is flushing out, and so it's filling with water. And if they have any open wounds, which they do, I give them 20 minutes to live after this. They're in this like disgusting sewer, and it's filling up with water, and they're like swimming through it. Girl, you're gonna get the gnarliest infection. Like, you are actually, if you make it out of this, I think you've got 20 minutes in the desert before you drop dead. But I bring this up because there is this quote. We're in chapter 25 now. Maybe this is where death finally catches me, finally gets to cackle at the sight of me drifting into a watery grave. Or maybe he'll embrace me like an old friend. That's from Harry Potter. Like, that is lifted from Harry Potter. And I was never a Harry Potter girl. Like, I was never into Harry Potter. But I know that quote because it's one of the most iconic in the series. I don't think that by itself this is particularly damning, but in a series that already has so many plagiarism allegations, it doesn't look great. And also it's taking place in a scene that already really reminded me of the scene from Tangled, where Rapunzel and Flynn Rider are escaping through like a tunnel that's filling up with water. Because there's this point where they have to like, there's a sewer grate that they have to like remove, and it's really hard, and they're like pushing it out, and it reminded me of when in Tangled there were some rocks in the way and it was really hard and they had to push them out, which again, I don't think by itself is damning. I don't think that that alone is enough to say like, oh, you plagiarized. But given that there are so many plagiarism allegations surrounding the series, it's not a great look. It doesn't look fantastic. They get out and they make out again, and they say, I hate you so much, and then they kiss. They've been doing this. I kind of forgot to mention when it started because I forgot to write it in my notes, but they have been kissing. So we cut back to Kit, and he's getting advised by Callum. You might not remember Callum because he was barely relevant, but Callum is one of the leaders of the Resistance, and he's now giving Kit advice because I suppose we'll find out in book 3. And he gives Kit a box, and this box upsets Kit. And is there anything else I want to say? Oh yeah, there is. He also reminds Kit of the 3 B's that his dad taught him, and there are 3 B's to being a successful king, and they are bravery, benevolence, and brutality. Are benevolence and brutality compatible? I think is hysterical. I think it's really funny that like the king, this like horrible evil man, is giving his kid like nursery rhymes to remember how to be a good king. I imagine that there's like a song to go along with the 3Bs so that he can remember it better. But yeah, again, and I'm making fun, but again, I actually really like the narrative of Kit becoming like a mad king. There's this, people talk about him and they say like, oh, he's going crazy, like he's losing it. It's pretty clear that he's just depressed. But there's this idea that he's becoming a mad king like throughout the story, and I really like that. I think that's really fun. Like I really like that kind of narrative, this like slow descent. I think that's really interesting. So to be clear, like I'm poking a little bit of fun, but I actually do, I like I like these chapters. I want to take a little bit of a break to talk about Dor. I don't think that Dor is really detailed or developed enough to be a representation of anything that has ever existed, but it is a desert city full of sand and merchants, and the people cover their hair and their faces, and there's a lot of crime, and it kind of gives like Hollywood's near/Middle East, where it's like Agrabah from Aladdin or Egypt in The Mummy, where everything has that like yellow filter over it. I'm sure you guys have seen examples of it, and I'm sure there are more examples that I can't remember right now, but it just kind of has that kind of feeling to it, where it's like this Western representation of an idea of Arabia/the Middle East. And I don't want to say that this is like intentional or anything. I don't think that it is meant to be representative of those regions. I don't think that it is intentionally like kind of a bad representation. But I do think it's a choice. And I don't think it's a great choice. And also adding to that, I didn't mention, but Kai's surname is mentioned so many times between the prologue and chapter 1. It's mentioned like probably like 8 times. I didn't count, but it's mentioned a lot. His last name is Azur, which is a Middle Eastern name, and I think that that's also a little bit of a choice because, you know, your extremely violent extremist torturer guy is gonna have this Middle Eastern last name, and I don't think that that's intentional, really. I think that she probably just chose his name because it sounds cool, but again, it's a choice, and it's one that maybe we should have chosen something different. I think that Dor is kind of similar to the cities in Ilya, because in my last video I compared the cities in Ilya to Gotham City, where it's just like, it's like urban, but there's a lot of crime, people are running around, there's merchants, and like, it's just like full of crime. She lives in Loot Alley, which is so comic book. And I think that Dor is very much just like the sand version of that. And I don't like that in terms of just narrative. I don't think it's very strong because it doesn't set up really any contrast between the two places. And I think it would be so much more interesting if there was a contrast. Like, for example, and this is like, just, I'm being very revisionist in this video, which I don't like, but for example, what if Dor was actually really wealthy and they were doing well for themselves? Everybody respected each other. There was more equality because they don't have the division between elites and ordinaries. People don't treat each other differently because of their abilities. Everything's pretty equitable. And Pei gets there and she realizes like, oh, that's what the world could be like if I didn't exist in this society. And it is very simplistic to say like, oh, this country bad and this country good. Obviously, that's not how the real world is. But again, we're not having a very in-depth discussion of politics in this book. So I think that just like a little bit of very simplistic commentary would strengthen it in that regard. And it's also, it would be another opportunity to force Kai to consider if maybe he's wrong. If he gets to Dor and he's like, oh shit, like people are so happy. There's no poverty here. Everybody respects each other. Why isn't it like this at home? And then he would have to think about why it's not like that at home. And he knows the answer, but he'd have to come to it. And I think that that could be a really interesting thing for us, to see the difference between Ilya and the rest of the world, to see the consequences of what like the system of government that Ilya has versus the rest of the world. And again, I know it's very simplistic, but I think that just that amount of contrast would be good. And then maybe later into the series, further into the book at least, we can start to see the cracks in that. We can start to see the issues with Dor and that nowhere in the world is perfect. But we can see that improvement is possible. And I think that that would be interesting in the book. A very large part of this middle chunk is, again, episodic, Wattpad-esque, doesn't really affect the plot as a whole, so I'm gonna speedrun it, and I'm just gonna give you the bullet points of what goes down once they escape the tunnel filling up with water. They don't get infections, which is frankly miraculous, but Kai chains their ankles together so that she can't escape him, but then they also have to like walk through town, so they have to constantly be hiding it. They go to a casino to escape some guards, I guess, and Kai is like, I'm not gonna lose. I never lose. And because gambling is so notoriously skill-based. There's an only one bed trope again. We do this twice. They slow dance in the desert. They get attacked by bandits. Okay, this part's actually really real. She makes him like close his ears, or like cover his ears whenever she pees so that he doesn't hear her, which is too real. Honestly, so I would do the exact same thing. So like, that's really funny to me, actually. They go to a poppy field, which is cute, and they slow dance again. Oh my god, I almost just threw up. I was kind of hoping they would start like eating the poppy seeds, but that doesn't happen. Also, almost all the people they talk to in the book, like everybody they encounter is like a gross man. Almost everybody they talk to in this book is a guy. That's not really a note in any capacity. It's just like, why are there so many men? Like, statistically, you've got to find at least one woman. There is one woman in the Resistance, but I really do think that she's the only other named female character that we really interact with, because Blair is not in the book and Adina's dead, and they were our other two female characters. Oh wait, actually Kit interacts with their mom, the queen, but not around Pei. So it's just like everybody they meet on the street like is a man. And that's a little bit odd. Kit mentions in one of his chapters that he and Kai got really close after Ava. And we find out that Ava is Kai's little sister who died when she was 4 years old and he was 12. This is also the person that he was eating a sticky bun for at the beginning of the book. And so, first of all, their names are really similar. Kit really like doesn't seem to be that affected by Ava's death, at least like in comparison to Kai, and that's a little bit understandable because Kai and Ava were full siblings, but Kit and Ava were half siblings. Kit and Kai have different moms, but still, like, it is still his sister, and it's a little bit weird that he doesn't really seem to have that same kind of grief for her. But it's also just like, more importantly, it's so fucked up that he's like reminiscing on this time where where Kai was in such deep grief over his like baby sister dying, and like he's looking back on that time and being like, oh, that was so hard for Kai. Like, our relationship really blossomed after that. We became so close. That's so messed up. And once again, I love it. We read Pei's dad's diary, which she took from her house before Kai burnt it down, and he has been keeping the same diary for like 10 years, which is really impressive. But it starts off, he's like, he reveals that the disease which ordinaries are claimed to have is a lie, and that the king has been paying off all the healers to keep that lie going. And he also reveals that Peyton is adopted, so that's why she's ordinary and he's elite. Kai's really shaken by this because he's like, no, if there's no difference, that means that I've been killing innocent people. And I have a couple of issues with this. Well, you knew that they were innocent, because if you didn't, why were you not killing the kids? Like, if you genuinely were so indoctrinated into this belief that you fully believed these people were a threat to civilization, why were you not killing the kids? And second of all, You knew this because you've used healer abilities. If the healers are the ones who are able to sense the disease, then Kai has taken on healer abilities at many times throughout the series and used them on Pei. So he would have been able to pick up on the fact that she either does or does not have that ability, have that disease. Also, again, with the fact that like mixes exist, implies that like regardless of whether or not there is a disease, there is some amount of truth to the idea that that ordinaries are a threat to elite power, which is not great. So is this really a moment that forces Kai to reevaluate things, or have we already established that he doesn't have to? They make it back to Ilya, and Kai confesses that he's falling in love with her. But then they have to go to the king. Peyton confesses to her crimes in front of like the court of the nobles, and Kit has this speech, and he's described as like visibly disheveled. He like hasn't shaved, and he's poorly dressed and stuff. And he tells them like, "Listen, I know that there have been rumors about me going mad, but that's not true. I'm fine," which is like notoriously such a great way to make people think you're doing well, is for you to get up in front of everybody looking bad, looking visibly like you're not doing okay, and be like, "Guys, I'm not crazy." That has a really high success rate, I'm sure. But he tells her, and I'm paraphrasing here, but this is the vibe. He says, "Peyton Gray, for your crimes, I sentence you to marrying me." And then he opens up the box and there's a ring inside. But hold on to that thought, because we have an epilogue from Kai, and it's just him being like an emo sad boy, and he's like, "Oh, I can't believe I have to watch Pei marry my brother, and I'm so upset." And then it fucking ends off with the quote that I put in my thumbnail from the last video. It gets reused in this book, and the final sentence of the book: "Because the beast doesn't get the beauty." You're kidding. Writing that once was too many times. But I guess I don't have too much to say about this plot twist just yet, because we don't know a whole lot of the reasoning behind it. We know that Callum is the one who gave him the box, who seemed to be like pushing him towards this, so there's something going on there. But yeah, I mean, that's it. That's what happens in this book. I have some predictions for the sequel, though, because I was so successful with my predictions from the previous book that I want to give you some predictions for the next one. I think that Kai and Pei are going to get together. They're obviously like the end game. This is very much like, it's a love triangle, but it's also like Kit doesn't stand a chance. So I think there will be like a scene where Kai walks in on her in her wedding dress, and it's either going to be like she's getting it fitted or she's just getting ready for the wedding, and he's going to say like, I wish it was me that you were meeting at the altar, or something like that. Like, "I wish it was me you were wearing this dress for." And she's gonna be like, "Oh, me too." And then they're probably gonna slow dance. I think that Kit will find out that Kai and Pei still have a thing for each other, and this will make him very angry, and as a result of that, I think he's gonna tell people that Kit has been disobeying their dad's orders by not killing the children and by sending them into the Scorches instead. And as a result of that, either he's going to demote Kai from Enforcer or charge him with treason. And in the case of treason, I think there's also going to be a like dungeon scene where he and Pei kiss between the bars, and maybe she helps him escape through the tunnel that we know is in one of the jail cells. And I know that prediction has a lot of like tangents coming off of it, so maybe not all of that will happen, or like none of it will happen, but that's kind of how I see it playing out. I'm hoping that Bitchy Blair returns as a bridesmaid, just because I love wedding drama. I think that could be really fun. Obviously, Blair will be slut-shamed again. I guess Jax can maybe be like the ring bearer or something. I don't know what. I don't predict him having a very large role in the story from this point out. I think he showed up once in this book, which is fine. I think the Resistance will wedding crash potentially, and that will be their re-entrance into the story. But I do think that maybe the Resistance wants Pae to be queen, and like that's Callum's end game, is that he wants her to be queen so that there's an ordinary queen, and this like that ends racism, right? I think that potentially Kit will die, but I'm not 100 on that because this doesn't really seem like the kind of series where main characters die, which is fine, but somehow I think he will be removed from office by the end of the book. Maybe he dies, or maybe he abdicates once he has a change of heart and he ends racism and he says like, oh, ordinaries actually aren't bad people. I will abdicate the throne. That's one thing he could do. Or he will get forced out because people think that he's becoming a mad king, or because he actually becomes a mad king. They'll like force him to step down. But somehow or another, he will not be king by the end of the series. And I'm 100 on that. And I think that Pae will be queen. I think that she is going to be the queen at the end. Not married to Kit, but I do think she'll be queen. Maybe married to Kai, but I don't really think so. I think that she might rule in her own right. And I know you might be thinking, oh, that's not a very poignant ending because she's not actually dismantling the system of power that allowed for the purging to happen in the first place. She's just continuing it. And so the power structure still exists and potentially could still be abused in the future. The people are having a temporary reprieve from the immediate threat, but there is still potential for threats in the future that are not being thwarted here. To that I say, yeah. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thanks for keeping me company while I talked about this book. Let me know if there's any other books you would like to see reviewed. You can friend me on Goodreads and keep up with me there. I think that's kind of all I have to say. Yeah. And if you made it this far in the video, thank you guys so much for being here. This was fun. Hope you had a good time. That's it. Bye.